don't try to understand new things too quickly because you're probably going to be wrong. And you're probably going to kill some really great ideas in their cradle.
I think that embryo screening is actually going to be the default way everyone has kids. I won this genetic lottery where I get to see my grandkids, right? And then for my mom, she lost it, right? Just because of a typo, a random, letter change. I don't want my child to suffer from what my mom suffered from.
I think people who are trying to regulate things like AI, things like you're doing out of existence, are literally committing suicide at the national level.
You get fire insurance, you get earthquake insurance, and those incidents are actually much less catastrophic and heart-wrenching than a child with a disease that's incurable. Now, it could be possible for us to use data at the earliest possible stage before you're even pregnant so that a baby has the maximum chance of being healthy.
Well, hello, everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with yet another Infinite Loops. I was chatting with my guest before we came on, and she asked me something no one has ever asked me. She said, what are your favorite episodes of this podcast? And I told her that potentially hers was going to end up among them because she fascinates me. My guest today is Noor Siddiqui, currently building Orchid, a technology company that is trying to focus on genetic screening for embryos, for couples. And we're going to talk a lot about that because I find it fascinating. You taught at Stanford on reproductive technology, and you also have a podcast, Conceive with Noor. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Jim. And what a very, very kind introduction. I really appreciate it. Awesome to be on here.
Awesome to have you. Let's start out with the fellow we were just chatting about before we hit record. You got a Peter Thiel Fellowship, and it seems from our research that rather than it being like, whoa, that's awesome, look at you, you got a lot of pushback from people on accepting the fellowship. Tell me about that.
Actually, yeah, I'm not sure who you're referring to. My parents were actually really, really supportive of it. I think they ended up being, they wanted me to stay in Virginia, and they ended up, obviously moving out to California to take advantage of the whole fellowship network. But no, they ended up being surprisingly supportive of it. I applied to the fellowship at the same time I was applying to college, and they grew up obviously really, really excited about coming to the U.S. to take advantage of the amazing education system here. They actually immigrated from Pakistan to the U.S. to go to college. So I think given their background, they were, shockingly supportive of it. But I think at the same time, I think it was really more the distance of going from the East Coast to the West Coast that they were sad about, not as much, the honor and how cool it is to sort of get the opportunity to, meet people who have built the companies that, we all get to use. I think that from the perspective of, learning how to build a company, there's no better person to learn from than, the people who started with the back of the napkin to, scaling it out to, millions of people and, made these companies household names.
And so the primary objection seems to have been you had to go all the way across the country from Virginia to California. What was that like for you? Because I'm an East Coast guy, but spend a lot of time in California. Was it a culture shock to go out there, or maybe to be able to collaborate with fellow geniuses that also were gaining fellowship?
Yeah, it was a huge culture shock, but I think in the most positive way possible, right? So I grew up in Northern Virginia. There's a lot of people who, work for the government. There's a lot of lawyers, a lot of engineers. So that's kind of all that I had saw, sort of doctors, lawyers, engineers. It's sort of you have three options when you grow up what you want to do. So I feel so lucky that at such a young age. So I ended up doing the interviews around when I was 17, that I got to come out to San Francisco and meet people who, were just building the most bizarre and surprising things, right? Like everything from, I mean, at the time, working on, curing aging was just totally insane, right? Like no one had, that wasn't even in the Overton window at all. The idea that you could even attempt to work on, curing aging or fusion. I mean, now they've gotten much more into the zeitgeist over the last 10 years or so. But I think it was just incredibly inspiring for a young person because, when you're young, you only see what's, locally around you. And I felt so lucky to get to meet people who had kind of busted the doors wide open in terms of like, you can work on something incredibly ambitious, even starting at a super young age and not having, spent, 20 years in the field. I think the East Coast vibe is much more like, don't even start working on something even mildly ambitious until you've spent 20 years in the field. And I think that, that kills a lot of great ideas because the problem is that if you've already been working on a problem for 20 years, then you've by definition kind of, you're not looking at it with fresh eyes. You're looking at it from the perspective of, the other people in the field. And that's obviously really useful. You should always have domain experts. But I think the thing that's really unusual and special about the Bay Area is that the attitude is one of like incredible optimism and incredible excitement. And obviously a lot of, ideas fail. But the fact that there's this tolerance for failure or this tolerance for, thinking about something incredibly ambitious also leads to, really, really incredible companies that couldn't have been started elsewhere. And if you just look at the funding environment, like, the vast majority of like, the most successful companies get founded here, pretty much across every category. And I think the reason why is it's really special. It's really hard to get so many, really ambitious founders and investors all in the same place. And even after they dispersed during COVID, they kind of all ended up aggregating, again here. And I just think that for me particularly, I think it totally changed my life trajectory because if I'd stayed in Virginia and I went to an East Coast school, I don't think I would have gotten that exposure to basically taking your own ambitions really seriously, right? I think that the East Coast can kind of kill a lot of ambition and say sort of like, hey, you got to work on, the tried and true, try to do like a minor process optimization rather than like really, there's a lot of encouragement, I think, here for going for the most, the most ambitious version of your idea rather than like, okay, the incremental, like slight business optimization version of businesses, which I think is more popular on the East Coast. So I couldn't recommend the program more highly, and I couldn't recommend like at least like a visit to the Bay Area and just like meeting people who are working on startups, wherever it is you are more highly, because I think it just opens your eyes to something that you may have never even considered as like something that you could pursue. And I'm sure you probably experience the same, right? Like before you've met someone who's working on, investing sort of probably, seems like a super foreign idea. I think that the just exposure therapy aspect of it is huge because it's one thing to like read about something online or see something in a glossy magazine. It's totally different to like actually sit down for coffee and talk to that person or like just like be in an office of a startup. It just is like it's a different, I think you can just envision it a lot more clearly for yourself when you're actually in the environment rather than if you're like looking at someone on stage doing it.
Yeah, it's a Schnelling point for sure for startups. And I love your line to take your own ambitions seriously. That's something we try to really encourage at O'Shaughnessy Ventures and through our fellowship program. We're really looking in details.
That's amazing.
And the tails is where all of the interesting stuff resides in our opinion. Yeah. And were you ever encouraged? I guess maybe it's an East-West Coast thing. Were you when you were living on the East Coast? Were there friends or peers of yours that were like, "Noor, you're crazy. Why would you think you could work on that?" Or were your contemporaries more supportive, and it was we olds who were trying to calm it down a little bit?
No, I think it's I think on the East Coast, it's just not even in the like it's not even on the option list, right? Like if you're to think like A, B, C, D, it's like you go to college, you get a job, and like the job option, like there's like five, right? That's what you see everyone doing. So I don't think it's two things, right? It's the set of options is, I think, fewer that people even consider. And then the idea, if you propose the idea of doing something outside of the cookie cutter, I think that is, because it's not even on the option list, it's sort of like people don't have a response to it. It's sort of like, oh, that's bizarre and strange, and I haven't really heard of anyone doing it. Versus I think on the West Coast, it's totally opposite. I would say like the default is work on something really incredibly ambitious for as long as you want on a shoestring budget. And then if for some reason, none of those things end up panning out, then okay, all this other stuff that on the East Coast is the default, those are your backup options. And I really liked that reorientation because, those are, working on something that could help a lot of people that, might not exist otherwise is, always the kind of thing that I found most exciting. And the idea of being around a group of people where that's actually celebrated rather than met with a lot of skepticism is, I think, really, really special, right? Because when an idea is young, it's it's frail and it's fragile, right? And you could either have an environment that supports it to grow into that like massive oak, these like really incredible, companies like, Apple and Google that were started in garages on shoestring budgets, or they can get killed, right? And I think, unfortunately, I think the environment on the East Coast is more likely for them to, basically for that seedling never to even, make it out, because it just remains in someone's idea. It just remains an idea, because folks around would basically, if you brought it up, they would immediately say, oh, that sounds odd, or that's weird, rather than the default on the West Coast is, oh yeah, go do it, like try it out.
Yeah, I always try to find things to root for as opposed to against, because rooting against things just seems so painfully obvious to me. I mean, like, that's easy. You,
Yeah,
you really need to spend a lot more time looking at ideas, looking at people, and saying, wow, that is really super cool, which kind of leads me to what you're doing right now.
yeah.
I think what you're doing right now is super cool. So tell us the story about what led you to found the company and actually go for making the next generation's health span. I guess that's a Peter Attia line, right? Didn't he write a book about that? I think better than
Yeah.
previous generations. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. I guess the story of Orchid starts pretty young. So my mom has this condition called retinitis pigmentosa. So what that means is that she started progressively going blind in her 30s. So what happens is you start by losing your night vision, then you lose your peripheral vision, and then slowly, as your retina degrades, you lose, the vast majority of your central vision as well. So that diagnosis took actually many years to get to. She kind of went around to a ton of different specialists, talked to them about her symptoms, and eventually this diagnosis ended up. They all sort of converged on it, and it was a really, really hard diagnosis to receive, because obviously, if you grow up and live your life as a sighted person, the idea of your vision and all of the independence that comes with having vision getting ripped away from you is incredibly frightening, right? And then there's also this denial or this hope that maybe it's not as bad as the doctors are saying, right? Maybe the vision won't degrade as fast or as severely as the doctors are saying, right? And unfortunately, they were correct, and she did end up losing her vision, and it was really hard, I think, for everyone in her family to see her life get hijacked. And I think, in that period, the very long period where, that diagnosis was getting converged on, there was also this fear of, is this going to affect her siblings, like my aunts and uncles? Is it going to affect us, her kids? And then, just that fear and uncertainty of like, something that I think we all take for granted, which is like, being able to wake up and see the sun every morning, or seeing your grandkids, isn't going to be something that you're going to be able to do. And I think kind of what struck with me during that whole time was just this unfairness, right? It's just, I won this genetic lottery where I get to see my grandkids, right? And then for my mom, she lost it, right? Just because of a typo, a random, letter change that she, when she was born and was being formed, she ended up having. just totally changed the trajectory of her life. And it wasn't my grandparents, her parents' faults. Like, she didn't inherit it from them. It just spontaneously, randomly, by just sheer horrible luck, happened to her. And I think that just struck me as like, this is a huge unfairness in the world. And obviously at the time, teenager, elementary school, when all this stuff started. I think that just struck me for really, like, kind of like burned a hole in my heart for a while. And then when I was at Stanford, I was studying computer science, and I was working in a lot of different labs on different types of computer vision or deep learning applications. Predicting transcription factor binding, or predicting, melanoma versus carcinoma. And just by chance, I ended up coming across these really large data sets where you have hundreds of thousands of people with their sequence data, so their DNA sequence, paired with their medical record. So, okay, what's your LDL level? What's your blood pressure? Did you get diagnosed with schizophrenia? And it was just really cool to see, because rewind a decade earlier, those data sets didn't exist, right? Like, sequencing was way too expensive. It wasn't dominant enough for those data sets to exist. And it was the promise of the Human Genome Project that cost over $1 billion to get the first human genome sequenced. And now finally sequencing had gotten cheap enough. Organizations had aggregated all of this data, and for me as a computer scientist, I was like, this is cool. Like, now genetics is a computational science. Now we can actually be useful. We can build these models. We can quantify risk for genetic diseases in ways that weren't possible before. And for me, as I was getting older, I was getting engaged and things like that. Like, the application that jumped out to me as the most obvious and like the most massive, like human history trajectory altering impact, was being able to use this data in the context of pregnancy and having babies, where I don't want my child to suffer from what my mom suffered from. But not only that, we have data now on thousands of genetic diseases, and I don't have to take that risk for my child. They can just avoid all of these diseases that would result in a baby in the NICU. A baby that has like a horrible birth defect, that has, developmental delay. There's so many diseases that we now know about that we don't have to roll the dice and, leave to chance. Now it could be possible for us to use data at the earliest possible stage, before you're even pregnant, so that, you can identify an embryo that is, free of these, pathogenic or disease-causing mutations, so that a baby has the maximum chance of being healthy. So that was the application that was obviously like the most exciting for me, given my life experience and my family history. And as I was thinking about do I want to like what do I want to work on? What's kind of my life's work? What's the hill that I want to die on? This one was like a clear winner. I was sort of like basically helping everyone have a healthy baby, helping families who've suffered tremendously from, a disease, either, they themselves, the parents are affected, or the child is affected. It was just so obviously something that, I'd be willing to, it was just a hill that I was obviously willing to die on. And, having done the Thiel Fellowship and seeing how incredibly hard startups are, even for something that, I think people think, something like, Pinterest, oh, you're just like putting, images online. It's like, it's an incredibly hard process to build a company from nothing. There's just so many challenges along the way. So I wanted to make sure that whatever I worked on was something that, was at least, for some number of years previously, and what I can envision myself for at least a decade into the future, something that would continue to motivate for me, and that I think had a shot at being my life's work. And basically being able to help families have healthy babies was something that, that definitely checked the boxes there. So, so what the company actually does is that we've built the world's first whole genome sequencing report for embryos. So what happens during IVF is that you have multiple embryos. So I guess to back up a little bit, what happens to to the woman is that you take injections for about medication for about 10 days to mature your ovaries. So your ovaries, during a natural menstrual cycle, they release one egg, but actually dozens to hundreds of eggs are actually lost every month. So what the medications do is they mature all of those eggs that would have otherwise been lost that month, so that you can grab them and save them in the freezer. So after you do that retrieval, so basically grabbing those eggs after about 10 to 14 days, you can fertilize them with your partner's sperm and you create embryos. So you have about anywhere from 5 to 20 embryos during an IVF cycle. And then where Orchid comes in is that the edge of that embryo is sampled by the embryologist. So about 5 cells from that day 5 embryo, that's about 125 cells, get sent to Orchid's lab. And then what we're able to do is that we're able to get 100 times the data on that embryo compared to legacy technology. So we can get 99.6% of the embryo's genome. And what we can do with that 100x data is we can report on conditions that previously were undetectable or would have been missed by the older technology. So we can tell parents about each embryo's risk for pediatric cancer, adult onset cancer, heart defects, skeletal defects, a whole range of genetic birth defects, neurodevelopmental disorders, intellectual disability, autism. There's just an incredible number of single gene diseases as well as polygenic diseases. So polygenic diseases are the ones where it's not just one gene, but it's the cumulative effect of millions of variants that are driving risk. So examples of that would be something like schizophrenia or heart disease or bipolar disease, where we're basically quantifying the genetic predisposition to disease. It's not a yes or no, does this embryo have this specific genetic variant that's linked to autism or linked to retinoblastoma type of pediatric cancer. So we give parents this massive 100x upgrade on the amount of genetic information they can have on their embryos, and then they use that information to transfer the embryo that is healthiest, so that the parents have the maximum chance of having a healthy baby. And what's really cool is that this has been kind of like the holy grail for 40 years, right? Since IVF was invented, people have wanted to have this level of information on their embryos, and we've been the first company to be able to introduce it. And the product is now live nationwide all across the U.S. Babies have been born. Dozens of pregnancies are in process, so it really feels I don't know. It's a particularly like rewarding moment for me, because at the very beginning, people thought what we were trying to build was impossible, right? It was sort of just a dream to be able to do it, and now kind of going full circle to have brought it, have published the papers, to actually have happy moms with happy babies is just really cool. So it's really awesome to be able to serve so many people who are in the situation where they could potentially benefit from having this upgraded information on their embryos.
So I think genetics is fascinating. It's always been fascinating to me. I did the rabbit hole jump on, identical twins separated at birth. And in fact, there was a huge study done at my alma mater, the University of Minnesota, on twins that were identical, and the striking similarities between them, even though they'd never met each other in many regards. But it's also, which I find somewhat odd, genetics seems to also be like a really hot button issue.
Yeah.
A lot of people that I've talked with who I would normally think of as, open-minded, sort of progressive mindset people, like when the subject of either, the implications of genetics or things like this come up, well, you can't play God and you can't do this. And I'm like, I don't get that at all. I mean, I understand the point where some people would want to ask a lot of questions, sure. But it seems to me that if you have the ability to make sure that your child is going to have the greatest chance at a successful physical, at least life, and mental, from what you've said, it seems like a universal good. Have you heard from people who are on the other side of this issue? And if you have, how do you address them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's for some reason I would say that these types of objections are like magnetized for anything around reproductive technology. So there's like a
Yeah.
really interesting history of of reproductive technology. So something as like simple and standard as birth control, so literally just contraception condoms, were banned in the US. So there was these laws called the Comstock or obscenity laws, where even the mention of birth control, like literally just condoms, was considered obscene, and people were jailed for putting that in a newspaper, selling anything. Like it was just considered, it was people were allergic to the idea that people should be able to control when they have kids, right? So it took decades of fighting. There was a Supreme Court case just to get married women the ability to purchase condoms, right? And in order for them to do that, they had to get approval from their husbands. And that was like a massive, like, I think 30, 40 plus year fight to get that right. And then, I think an additional decade or two for the right for unmarried women to have access to contraception. And then there was another like massive debate and fight over the introduction of the epidural. So basically pain relief during pregnancy. So pain relief was offered in every other part of medicine, from dentistry to, different types of surgeries. But the idea of using an epidural during pregnancy was sort of like this massive debate around, shouldn't women suffer during pregnancy because, Eve suffered or something. I don't even know the whole debate or reasoning why. But I think there is this special, I mean, I think everyone knows that there's this like specialness to giving new life. I mean, it's clearly a miracle. It's like just a massive, beautiful thing that happens. So I think that the correct orientation is to have more scrutiny over that area and more protection for, the vulnerable, pregnant mom and baby. But to me, the transition from, home birth to hospital birth did that, right? And it was met with a lot of skepticism of, why are you medicalizing, the process of giving birth? But, it like massively reduced fetal and maternal mortality by, having access to everything you have in a hospital during the delivery process. And similarly, IVF was also met with a massive amount of, pitchforks and, concern was, and 12 million people wouldn't exist today if IVF wasn't invented. So I think people discount future people too much, right? Like those 12 million people that wouldn't exist. And then at the time, people were so against the idea of IVF. So I think people, when thinking about this technology, really need to consider future people, right? The idea that, now we could slash incidence rates for every major disease, because instead of, again, rolling the dice and randomly getting a random outcome, you can avoid these horrible diseases that unfortunately we don't have cures for and that are much more common than people realize. So just for that category of single gene genetic diseases, there's actually 30 million Americans in the US that have rare disease, so 10% of the population, even though each individual rare disease, terrible naming, under 200,000 people are affected. If you aggregate or add up all of the thousands of diseases, it ends up being this massive number, 10% of Americans, 30 million people, right? And for most of those people, 95% don't have any treatment option. So it's sort of like, okay, you're kind of stuck in this situation where drug companies don't want to develop treatments because the market sizes are too small. So it's like this huge failure of our system to be able to help these people. And we have this opportunity now for at a really the fraction of the cost of even the best treatment. So in the case of my mom for retinal pigmentosa, the first gene therapy was actually developed for her condition. It was called Luxturna. It was approved, I think, in 2017 or 2018, and it costs $800,000 per eye. And it doesn't reverse the blindness. It just prevents it from progressing. And then again, only a really small fraction, less than 5% of people with retinitis pigmentosa are eligible because they have this specific variant, RP65, that Luxturna treats. So the vast majority of these diseases, unfortunately, there's so many different typos that the gene therapies can't even, help everyone. They can only help the fraction that have the specific typo that the gene therapy targets. So cures and treatments are incredibly hard and expensive to come by. They typically cost $1 billion plus to bring to market. Once they are in market, they're incredibly expensive. They do have side effects, versus this alternative is like a vaccine for every known disease. before you're even pregnant. So I'm just super, super excited to give this opportunity to parents. And I agree that obviously pregnancy is this like magical, beautiful, incredibly special moment. So I think every company and technology that's operating in that space, needs to be operating at an incredibly high standard and to demonstrate the effectiveness of that technology. And that's why we've been really slow and methodical and careful about all the studies that we put together before we started offering it. And just feel really proud to be in a place to be able to give parents so much more information for this incredibly important decision and moment in their lives.
Yeah, and bringing up the almost religious fervor that people get whipped up around this stuff brings to mind the fact that I'm 64. I just turned 64, and in my own lifetime, the change. Thank you. In my own lifetime, the changes, particularly in the United States, would be mind-boggling to people if they actually looked at the progress that's been made. In 1971, as you mentioned, women could not get credit cards without their husband's permission. How fucked up is that? And like when you go back and see, I think that in most cases, it hasn't all been changed for the positive, but the vast majority of changes and what is now accepted, would have been inconceivable to somebody looking at this from 1971. And that's why I think context is so important. If you don't have context, you might have some sort of immediate or emotional reaction to a position that maybe isn't warranted. And I look at things like this and I'm like, are you kidding me? How can I sign up a dozen people for this, or 100, 1,000? Because what you're doing is not really. When I've had conversations with people specifically about things like CRISPR and gene therapy, that's where I find a ton of people with a real hot button. Have you ever seen the movie Gattaca? I'm like, yes, I've seen the movie Gattaca. And it seems that another part of all of this, I don't know, I'm a huge fan of David Deutsch and his book, The Beginning of Infinity, in which he argues that essentially the precautionary principle leads usually, if taken to excessive lengths, leads to stasis, which in my opinion is death, right? It's brain death. If you're in a stasis situation, that's not a good look. What are the most common findings? And I'm also really interested, how do the potential parents react when they get the full report from the embryo project?
Yeah. I think it might help me to kind of just give you some vignettes of some of the types of patients who kind of come to us, and then I can get into that. So so there's one of our patients where they had a child with a de novo or spontaneous mutation in a gene called KCNQ2. So unfortunately, that leads to very, very severe developmental delay. The child not being able to talk, not being able to walk, just very severe symptoms. And they came to us because they wanted to screen for this in their subsequent embryos, so they had a chance to have a healthy baby. So sometimes people come to us because they've had a first child with a very severe disease, and they want to mitigate the chance that affects their next child. Another example is a condition called smooth brain disease. So unfortunately, it's a mutation in a gene that causes the brain to form incorrectly and not grow at the normal rate. Unfortunately, it's terminal. Those children, don't end up really being able to. The vast majority don't end up being able to, reach elementary school age. So that family is actually one of our philanthropic cases where we're actually trying to cover the vast majority of the screening costs so that family has a chance to have a healthy baby. We also have families where they have one of the parents has a history of a complex condition. So a brother has schizophrenia. Oh, good. the other situation was, parents who are suffering from a condition themselves. So we had, individuals who had a family history, like a brother or a aunt or uncle with schizophrenia or with bipolar disease, and they want to, minimize the chance that that affects their future child. So for those conditions, what they get is a percentile. So is this embryo in the 99th percentile of schizophrenia, or are they in closer to the 50th percentile? And the higher the percentile, the higher the base rate of the disease. So in those higher percentiles, you might have a 3x or 5x chance of developing the disease compared to the baseline average. So they kind of get a lifetime absolute risk as well as a percentile for each embryo, and they can try to transfer the embryo that has a minimum genetic load or genetic risk for that specific disease. And then the other thing that I found really, really interesting is that we've started having cases where we actually diagnose parents from the embryos. So they'll come to us, maybe one of the examples that I'm thinking of is, the father is older, so we call that advanced maternal age, and older fathers contribute more paternal mutations. So unfortunately, sperm, just like eggs, accumulates genetic mutations, and those can lead to much higher rates of neurodevelopmental disorders like autism, intellectual disability, other types of things. So sometimes when we have older fathers, that's an indication for wanting to use sort of more advanced whole genome embryo screening. So they came for that, and then what they ended up finding out is that half the embryos have this single gene form of diabetes called MODY. And mom and grandma were already being treated for that condition, but they didn't know that it was genetic. They were doing all the treatments, but they didn't know what the actual genetic cause was. So from the embryos, even though we were looking for neurodevelopmental disorders, we ended up finding out, okay, half the embryos have this single gene genetic form of diabetes called MODY. And then we also were able to tell mom and grandma that that was the cause of their condition. We also, I think, found a case where, some of the embryos had something called a microdeletion that ended up that causes seizures. It's something called X-linked. So females are XX and males are XY. So females have a less severe manifestation of the disease because they have two X's. So one X can kind of compensate if it's a functional copy plus a broken copy. And if you're a male, you have XY, so you only have one functional copy. So if that copy is broken, then you have no functional copy. So the males are more severely affected. And so it wasn't reported to us that mom was having some seizures, but she actually was, and that mutation was present in some of the embryos, but not all of them. So we're constantly really shocked and impressed by that, because it kind of goes to show that whole genome screening isn't the default for people today. And even though people are doing this because they want to prevent diseases in their embryos and their future kids, they're actually going to get some answers about, these symptoms that doctors are just treating the symptoms of, but not identifying the root cause of in themselves. And I also find that really interesting and really compelling, because once they find out the real genetic reason, then that can actually guide treatment. And again, obviously has awesome implications for the next generation, where if it's a milder disorder, then, they can prepare for it early. If it's something that's more severe that, they really hate having to deal with, they can usually identify an embryo that's unaffected from that specific disease and just avoid it entirely for their kiddos.
Amazing, because the IVF obviously is how you're able to do it for embryos, but you also have a saliva test that people who are just not using IVF can take. What can that tell them about their own predispositions and what they could do when they have that knowledge?
Yeah. So it's kind of like what I was just saying earlier about sometimes we're diagnosing parents from their embryos, right? So the benefit of doing the saliva testing is that you can find out about the information about yourself. So we have whole genome reports for parents that they can just submit via a spit test. And the difference again here is it's a lot more data. So something like 23andMe, their testing is, very affordable, but it is only looking at a very, very small fraction of the genome. So, the downside of looking at a small fraction of the genome is that you can kind of think of it as Are you doing spell check on a single page in your textbook, or are you doing spell check on the entire book? So if you're only looking at a small section of the genome, you're only able to look at risks for that one page or really small segment, versus we want to be as comprehensive as possible, because this is a super important step, which is having kiddos. So what the advantage of the saliva testing is that parents understand their own risks, and we actually simulate embryos. So when you have a baby, you get half the DNA from mom and half the DNA from dad, but they can combine in a lot of different ways. So we simulate 1,000 embryos that could emerge from mom and dad, and then we show the risk distribution. So we just show how much risk for a specific disease would you be able to mitigate for the ones that are polygenic, or the ones that involve anywhere from dozens to millions of variants that are kind of included in a risk score. So for the polygenic risks, you kind of see, okay, how much could we mitigate risk? So how much could we reduce the risk by identifying embryo that's the lowest risk of the batch that you and your partner would create. And then for those monogenic ones, you find out, okay, does mom or dad have the disease at all? And then you have to do the actual embryo testing to look for spontaneous or novel mutations, right? So for the condition that affected my mom, if you screened my grandparents, they wouldn't have it. But unfortunately, it spontaneously happened in her. So the advantage of doing the embryo testing is that you can look for both inherited and non-inherited genetic changes. So inherited meaning comes from mom and dad, and non-inherited meaning new or novel mutations that happen in every embryo and in each one of us when we're formed. So the advantage of the saliva testing is that you can get more information about yourself and get kind of a in expectation result for the embryos or kids that you would have. And then that can help make the decision about, does IVF make sense for your family, or, does, the at-home process make sense for your family, because, you're so low risk for, every disease. You two already won the genetic lottery. So there's no screening that's necessary. But I think maybe one of my, spicier opinions is that I think that embryo screening is actually going to be the default way everyone has kids. I think that sex is going to be for, connection and for fun with your partner, and for something really important like having kids, everyone is going to choose to do embryo screening, because it's sort of like, you get, fire insurance, you get earthquake insurance, and those incidents are actually much less catastrophic and heart-wrenching than, a child with a disease that's incurable, right? It's sort of like if your house burns down, it sucks. You take a, big economic hit, but, you buy a new house, you kind of move on. And, if one of your children has a condition, it's sort of, it's much more painful, right? It's more painful than if you yourself have the condition. And, the fact that now it's not up to chance. Now it's, for so many conditions, we already know what gene is linked to that disease. I think that parents are going to choose that, hey, for something this important, I want to screen my embryos, identify the risks beforehand, and then transfer an embryo that's free of as many risks that, science knows about today. Because unfortunately, it's kind of the humbler position is that it's easier to identify a risk before the symptoms emerge than to actually be able to develop treatments and cures, because unfortunately those are really, really few and far between in our medical system today.
The use case for the saliva test seems like it could also extend to just people who want to know about their own potential risks, since you're looking at a much larger section of their genetic makeup than others. But then as I listen and you bring up insurance, like, what about the idea that once the insurance companies get their hands on this, like, they're going to simply deny anyone with pre-existing conditions?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. Fortunately, in the US, there's a law called GINA, so the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. So health insurance companies are banned from denying you coverage based on your genetics. So that's amazing. But so for health insurance, it's illegal to discriminate based on genetics. but actually for life insurance, it's not. So that's something to flag, is that, you may want to get a life insurance policy set up prior to getting genetic testing, because they are able to request genetic information for your life insurance policy. But yeah, I think that it will be really cool that there could be like an entire generation of kids that have lower life insurance premiums because they've already been pre-screened for some of the worst diseases. The other thing that's crazy is that like, what percentage of people would you guess who are in the ER? So basically, people in the ER, but you restrict it to people who are in the ER who are not there for an acute injury, so not like bullet wounds or car accidents. Like adults, so like 18 to like 45 years old or so. How many of those people in the ER do you think would have like a genetic reason why they're there?
Oh, wow. My guess would be that most people would say that the figure was low, so I'm going to go high. I'm
Yeah.
going to say that maybe a third of them.
Yeah. That's really close. It's actually 25%. So it's just massive. A quarter of young adults who are in the ER, there's a genetic reason why they're there. And I just find that so astonishing that, maybe if they had known about that typo or condition earlier, they could have had, treatments options to avoid it. And I guess what would be your guess for babies that are in the NICU, so the neonatal intensive care unit? Like, what fraction of babies do you think would are there for genetic reasons?
I'd go even higher there. I'd say maybe 50%.
Yeah. You're really close. It's 40%. So yeah, it's just massive. The numbers are so massive, and it's it's time to put all this like genetic data to use, right? I mean, we've been collecting it for 2 decades, and just like you're saying, it's really valuable to have it on yourself, because then it's not medicine one size fits all, where you just start screening at an average time. It's like, no, some people are at above average risk. They should probably start screening, 10 years earlier and start proactively managing it 10 years earlier. And other people are low risk, and it probably doesn't make sense for them to, maybe do screening at the same time. Maybe they can push it off a couple of years. So yeah, I think that the data is really valuable on ourselves. But the thing is about ourselves is that for now, our genetics are fixed versus, for our kids, they're not. You can actually totally avoid a condition. So it's just a really, exciting moment in history, right? Where, it used to be the case for, all of time previously that it was a lottery, and you had to just hope for good luck. So it's really cool to kind of have this transition point where, now parents get to make their own luck and mitigate risk for these diseases.
I'm very much on the side of this is what a fabulous time to be alive,
Yeah.
because of all of the discoveries that we're making. But what about, let me play devil's advocate and advance the thing that I hear a lot, which is, oh, well, once we let that happen, then parents are going to engineer their children to be a certain height, have certain color eyes, to have all of these things. How do you respond to those types of arguments?
Yeah, I think that it's so I guess to be very clear, like, we don't do that. We're a health focused company. So we're looking at things like,
Oh, and I didn't mean to imply that you do that. But
okay.
that's a common misunderstanding when people start talking about the ability to pick and choose. They are many a non trivial number of people immediately kind of like knee-jerk reaction is, but and as I said, but then everyone's going to be picking height, eye color, and all that. I know that isn't what you do, but I'd be interested in your response.
Yeah, I think it's sort of a societal conversation, right? Like, we're going to have to decide what information as a society do we want parents to have when they're making this decision about which embryo to transfer. And it's really interesting, the diversity of regulation on genetic testing across the world. So in China and India, for example, you cannot report on the sex of an embryo. And in the US, you can. And I think the other one that I think is really funny is that in France, paternity testing is not accessible. It's illegal. You have to get a court order in order to get a paternity test. And I'm not going to comment on why that would be so disruptive to French society. But I find that also hilarious, right? It's like something that's, you can just go online and buy that here in the US, but you need a court order to get that in France.
Yeah. um, the potential for advancement here just seems so huge to me. You mentioned that you're able to do a variation of in silico various tests on here's what the great number of embryos that from the saliva test, right?
Yeah.
What are you most excited about in terms of things that you feel are tangibly near, say, in the next 5 years in this field?
Yeah, I think that again, because this stuff is driven by data, and more people are getting sequenced, the number of diseases that we're going to be able to detect is only going to grow, right? So, for example, for autism, they've sequenced, Simon's Foundation has sequenced, I think, over 100,000 individuals and families who are affected by the disease, and they've identified, I think in the range of 100 to 200 genes that are linked to some of the most severe forms of autism. So these are individuals who are unfortunately nonverbal, very severely affected by autism, and sometimes a lot of other symptoms are associated with it. So as more individuals are sequenced, the number of genes and the fraction of autism that we're going to be able to detect is only going to grow, right? Similarly for pediatric cancer, for these heart defects, for these skeletal defects, for the single gene conditions, it's going to grow. And then also for the polygenic conditions, it's going to grow. So I think, right now we're looking at, a ton of different diseases, and there's, I think, more that are on the horizon that I think parents are very interested in. So things like propensity for substance abuse. There's just so many behavioral conditions, from addiction to suicide attempt, that are that are linked to your genetics, and to the extent that we can get more information and build models that more accurately and precisely quantify risk for those conditions. I think that that's going to be really powerful and is on the horizon soon. And the other thing is that the data sets that we have right now are quite biased toward Europeans. And there's been growing effort to get more and more data for different ancestries. So South Asians, for example, we get heart attacks 10 years earlier than any other ancestry, and we're twice as likely to die from those heart attacks. So for example, in my embryos, I'm trying to minimize risk for heart attacks. And so there's certain diseases that affect certain ancestries more often, and that often has a genetic link. And I think that's also really powerful, is that, okay, get more data on all the ancestries, and then also be able to help specific ancestries that have higher rates of certain diseases to mitigate that in their families. So I think more data is going to mean better models, more diseases, and more like fine-grained analysis, right? So whenever you're building these models, you need to have really good labels, right? So for something like LDL levels, like there's lots of different labels that you can use to define a disease, like heart disease or substance abuse or depression, right? So as the data we have gets this data sets get larger, hopefully the data sets will also get richer, right? So we're going to have more and more fine-grained measurements on each of those genomes, and that's also going to result in better models getting built, and better results.
Now, do you have plans as you move forward with the company to follow the children that were born under your protocol?
Yeah, so we've started sequencing the babies that are born, and it's really cool to be able to see that sequence that we got from the embryo, so before the pregnancy even began, and then the sequence data matches the baby. So that's some really cool early results that we have. And obviously we're super confident in the results. So I think eventually it'll be really cool to be able to show on, thousands of babies that the rates of those really awful outcomes, like, babies in the NICU with these really severe conditions, can go down, right? Because that's the whole goal, is that at a society-wide level, what if we could just have way less suffering? What if we could just have way less diseases, whether that affects babies or children or adults? Yeah, so I think it'll be fun to continue to enroll those families and to be continuing to publish on the results there.
You mentioned that much of the data, like most long-term health studies, are done pretty much, well, for the most part, were done on men, not on women.
Yeah.
So the Farmingham study, for example, was mostly men, and then they discovered, oh, women might be very, very different. And then also, what you mentioned that most of the data is on Westerners. Do you have any protocols to guard against algorithmic bias within your own protocols?
Oh, what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean by that, in data, and this is my old day job. I was a quant in financial investing, right? So if you get what looks like a self-selected sample, right, where the people are opting in, it may or may not be reflective of a larger random sample, right? And if
Yeah.
your algorithms are trained on a self-select, well, you mentioned earlier, right? The people who are coming and are finding your service particularly useful are people who have a suspicion or a certainty that they have some genetic anomaly in their family history, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious as to that self-selected sample might lead to algorithmic solutions or permutations in the modeling. That one that was done on a broadly based random sample would lead to a different algorithmic protocol.
I
See what I'm
see.
saying?
Yeah. So we've calibrated all of our models so that regardless of your ancestry, it's giving sort of the most accurate risk estimate for your embryos. And we basically explain that, hey, okay, the error bars are going to be higher if the data that's in the training set doesn't represent as closely your genetics. So we kind of quantify all of that stuff and do some really careful counseling on exactly what the differences are in the risk estimates depending on sex and depending on ancestry and those types of things. But yeah, that's a really interesting and important point. So yeah, I would say it's really interesting. I would say it's super diverse, the set of people who come to us, right? It's single mothers by choice. It's gay parents. It's parents who have a genetic disease, either themselves or in their family, who've had a first child with a genetic disease. But I would say we also have a ton of people who are, just, fully healthy, but, they're planning on having kids, in a few years, right? So they want to freeze their embryos and basically maximize the chance that their child is healthy because, the thing that's so funny is like, the healthiest time for, a woman to have a child is still like, 19 or 20 years old, right? But, we're still in college then, and it's not a convenient time to have kids in modern society. And it's really funny, on the coast, like San Francisco and New York, like the average age of a first time mother is, 33 bumping up to 34. And, a geriatric quote unquote pregnancy is 35. So if you want to have multiple kids, you're kind of almost guaranteed if you're on the, career track to be in that window. So I think it's really cool that there's this trend that's kind of emerging where, women are sharing information saying, hey, don't try and, freeze your eggs and embryos at 39 or 40. That's kind of too late. Go ahead and do it younger when you're in your 20s. And it's really cool to be seeing those couples. I'd say like a, double-digit fraction of our customers are folks who have, no genetic diseases, no plans to have kids immediately, but they're just proactively freezing, getting all this data on their embryos so that in a couple of years when they want to have kids, they have the the healthiest gametes and embryos that they can possibly have.
How long does a frozen embryo last?
Yeah, I think indefinitely. So the oldest embryo that was frozen, that was born, I think was about 30 years. That happened pretty recently. And I think that's super sci-fi and funny because feasibly those parents could be, 26, 27. So their embryo in some way could be older than them. Obviously, it's a newborn baby. But I don't know. I don't know. For some reason, I find that very astonishing. The idea that, a human could be in suspended animation for that long. And yeah, I mean, the freezing technology has come a long way. So 40 years ago, when IVF just started, the embryo survival rate was much lower. It was closer to like 50%. When you from freezing to unfreezing, now it's incredibly high. It's like 99%. So the vitrification or new freezing technology is really, really good. And yeah, it's just amazing. You know what I mean? It's sort of like for Orchid, for our embryo reports to be useful, it required massive advancements and investment from so many different fields, right? It was $1 billion investment to get the first human reference genome built. It was 40 years of innovation in IVF for it to be such a safe, convenient, successful process like it is today. It required machine learning and GPUs to get so much cheaper and more widespread, and those statistical techniques to get developed. So it's kind of amazing, like the convergence of all of these technologies, so that so that this has become something that's no longer sci-fi, but something that is parents are actually using today.
Did you have any plans to address? There's a lot of talk right now about the emerging digital divide, right? Where, and I have very distinct views on this. I think people who are trying to regulate things like AI, things like you're doing out of existence, are literally committing suicide at the national level, because there are going to be other countries that embrace it. And I think that that's going to cause a huge digital divide. What about the divide here of affordability, right? Are there any plans for this is giving me an idea, there should be a foundation where people who don't have the means to get this done, who can apply for a grant or anything. Have you looked into that at all?
Yeah. So we actually have a philanthropic program. So for folks who can't afford it, we're really happy to have this, this set of folks review the applications, and we want to accept as many as possible, because I totally agree. It's this is something that, is, a bit expensive today, but we want it to be something that's affordable and accessible to everyone. And already in the US, we're living in this really unfair status where, some families who have infertility can afford IVF, and they can either pay out of pocket, or they're at a really cushy company like Google who will cover it for them. And there's other families with infertility who aren't able to have a baby, right? The most fundamental thing, just because of a cost barrier. And I think that that's insane. I think that every insurance company and every company should be covering IVF plus genetic screening, because it's something that I think is really critical for families, right? So currently, the way their healthcare system is set up is that we're spending the vast majority of money, millions of dollars, to extend your life by 2 weeks at the very end of it, right? And it's I don't think anyone wants to spend, their last days, hooked up to life support. I think they would way rather have that money and those resources spent during this really, pivotal, time in their life where they're forming and growing their families. In terms of the cost, we really hope to make it more affordable, both from just the natural scaling and automation stuff that companies like us are going to be able to do. But we're also hoping for really widespread employer-sponsored health plans and insurance support, because again, it's something that's so critical. I would say from a national competitiveness perspective, right? I mean, think about it, right? The children are the future, right? It's it's a platitude for a reason. And if you have an entire population, an entire generation where the odds are stacked for them rather than against them, where they're not having their life hijacked by these horrible genetic diseases, whether it's earlier in life or later in life, I mean, that's a massive benefit, right? We're spending trillions of dollars managing the symptoms rather than the root causes of these diseases. And if we're able to apply this on a national scale, I mean, it's a huge advantage, right? All those trillions of dollars, that are locked up in, ineffective treatments can go to, cures, and to go to curing so many of these other diseases and other problems can go toward education. I mean, we can divert the money to, whatever, society thinks is most useful. But I totally agree with you. I think from a competitiveness standpoint, it would be a massive advantage for a country to adopt. And we've already been seeing, some of those forward-thinking countries in Asia and the UAE reach out to us and say, "Hey, this is a huge problem and a huge national priority for us. how do we get this technology over here? And obviously, I'm an American, so I want to see the greatest adoption here. But yeah, I mean, it all depends on what we choose as a society, right? I mean, if these other governments, make it super affordable, then obviously there's going to be higher uptake over there. So yeah, I hope this is something that we as a society choose to make a priority, because it can have massive benefits for individual families, and that accrues to us as a society as well.
Have you been able to discover new and novel genetic anomalies from the data of the people that you've screened? And if so, what have you discovered?
Yeah. I would say that the new discoveries and stuff that we've done are more on the chemistry and computational side, right? So the IP of the company is sort of a new chemistry or new protocol, or sort of new way to be able to get whole genome data off of embryos. So that's kind of the novel stuff that Orchid has developed. But in terms of the genetics, that's really more standing on the shoulders of giants of the entire global genetics community, right? So there's these groups of independent academic geneticists, and they meet annually or biannually to kind of look through all the papers that have been published all around the world. And they develop these databases where they say, okay, this variant, this gene is linked to this disease. And they kind of develop these operating procedures where they figure out, okay, here's the criteria to decide whether this gene is definitively linked to disease, or whether it's, disputed, or, only moderately linked. And we get to leverage that to be able to build these really powerful reports for parents. So what we really try to do is take what's already happening in either the pediatric or adult setting, and we just try to move that data up to embryos. And then we're kind of innovating, I'd say, more on the polygenic side. So for the single gene side, we take what the whole community has already agreed is working and super valuable. And then the polygenic side, where we're quantifying predispositions, that's where we get to kind of add some more of that computational spice and secret sauce to kind of get the most accurate possible results for specific families, depending on their specific ancestry composition or their own family history. So we can tell people based on their own family history, like let's say you have one mom that has breast cancer, rather than a mom and her sister have breast cancer, right? So we have advanced modeling that shows for your specific family, based on who is affected and unaffected by certain diseases, we can quantify the risk, most precisely for your embryos. And I think that that's also super powerful because, it's kind of like smoking, right? Where smoking is this massive lifestyle intervention where it makes you much more likely to develop lung cancer. It's not a guarantee that you get lung cancer, but it does make you much more likely. And these genetic predispositions are similar, where, unfortunately, if you are South Asian like me and you have a propensity toward heart disease, yes, you can exercise, and yes, you can, take, medication, but unfortunately your natural baseline risk is just still higher than other ancestries. So again, being able to democratize or, reduce that genetic privilege that some people have is really amazing. The idea that everyone can have, a fair shot at a healthy life is something that, is just like super cool to be able to offer to parents.
Well, I think what you're doing is absolutely fascinating. I think that, as I said earlier, I'm just so lucky to be alive at this part of the timeline, because seeing all of the innovations here and elsewhere, like, what a great time to be alive, honestly. And so I'm very impressed by what you are doing. I have two more questions. One is a bit of a diversion from what we've been talking about. And I noticed that two of your favorite essays were What You Can't Say by Paul Graham and Secrets by Peter Thiel. Just tell me, I'm fascinated by people's favorites in this regard. And so why are these two among your favorites?
That's a good question. Well, I think in terms of writing, what I really enjoy the most in writing is when someone is able to articulate an idea or a concept that you may have this sort of like vague feeling about or intuition about in your mind, but you haven't really sharpened into something concrete and precise. And I think that everyone sort of feels that, that feeling of, oh, that's something that I, can't quite talk about because, you'll face, skepticism, or you'll be ostracized. And sometimes there's a lot of things that are worth discussing there. And basically the taboo around it is, it can be suffocating and basically prevents really understanding, well, what's really going on here. And I think that, I think it can just be incredibly powerful, right? So I think in the context of what we're doing, again, there's this incredible amount of taboo around reproductive technology of, hey, don't touch this. This is sacred. This is something that, science and engineering shouldn't touch. And I feel the exact opposite. It's like, because it is sacred, because it is special, because it is so important, science and engineering should make it as safe for moms and their babies as possible. And I think that in examining that taboo, it's sort of like, well, it's not really well founded, right? And we kind of talked about, contraception, and we talked about epidural, we talked about IVF, and these were incredibly positive technologies that we all take for granted today. We all think that, it's obvious that a woman should choose when she gets pregnant, who she marries, that she should have the opportunity to choose IVF if that's right for her family. Infertility doesn't have to be something that, God wanted you to be infertile. No, we don't accept that anymore. Now it's, if you're infertile, you have opportunities to do IVF and to do procedures so that you can have a baby, right? And I think, in the future, it'll become obvious that, you should have the ability to have as much information as possible about your embryos to mitigate the chance that they have all of these diseases. And today, there is a little bit of, I would say fear around it. And I think that that's going to go away, just like it went away for these other technologies. And, it's really cool to be able to, be building something in that space. And I think there's a legacy of, great technologies, not just in the reproductive technology space, but in others that kind of took advantage of that same secret that they recognize, right? I mean, people used to think that, oh my God, how could you possibly get into someone else's car? Like, that's terrifying. Like, they could kidnap you. And yes, that does happen sometimes with Uber, but for the vast majority of people, they rely on Uber to be able to get around, right? And, self-driving cars ended up, resolving that problem around, rogue folks in the future. And for now, people are doing background checks to resolve that problem. And it's it's a trusted service. And, same for Airbnb. There was this immense fear of, oh my God, a stranger's home. Like, I would never stay in a stranger's home. And again, just totally, blasted open the capacity for, vacation stays in so many different geographies. There's a whole set of entrepreneurs who make their living, with Airbnb homes. And, I just think it's very true. I mean, I think some of the greatest ideas are hiding in plain sight, in the sense that, hey, there's these blinders on people where they say they won't look, they refuse to look in this one area because, society is pushing them away from looking there. And it can end up being like a gold mine for ideas, because so few people have the courage to actually think for themselves and look at, well, what do they actually think about that thing themselves, rather than what is everyone telling them to think about that thing. I just love, I think both of them are just such incredible writers, and they basically describe, this concept in a really articulate and beautiful way.
Yeah. And as you were talking about the fear, I think human operating system is guided by emotions mostly, and the dominant emotion that rules most of the others is fear. And when you look at how humans have responded to innovation and progress in the past, it's virtually the same picture, right? You go all the way back to novels, and everyone was losing their shit about, oh my God, this is going to corrupt the youth and whatnot. And I think that the disconnect is that we also have this weird idea that we know what the future is going to be.
Yeah.
We have this idea that we already know everything that's going to happen. And of course, we know nothing. Well, we know some things, right, directionally. But the idea, again, to quote David Deutsch, what were people thinking about quantum physics and the internet in the year 1900? Well, they weren't, because nobody had ever heard of or even conceived of those things. And that's why I'm so much more on the side of don't try to understand new things too quickly because you're probably going to be wrong and you're probably going to kill some really great ideas in their cradle.
Yeah.
Rather than letting them flourish. And I think what you're doing is a great idea, and it's no longer an idea. Now it is a reality, which I think is super cool. Well, our
Yeah.
final question on the podcast is we're going to wave a wand and we're going to make you the Empress of the world. Now, you can't put anyone in a re-education camp and you can't kill anybody. But what you can do is we're going to hand you a magical microphone and you can say two things into it. And the entire population of Earth is going to wake up whenever their morning is the next day. And they're going to think to themselves, I've just had two of the greatest ideas. And unlike all the other times, I'm going to actually act on these two ideas. What two things are you going to incept in the world's population?
Oh, okay. So what are the two ideas that I broadcast and then everyone actually does it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. I think one of them would definitely be, inspiration is perishable. So act now. I think that's a really, really big one. I think
love
those
that.
moments of clarity and that moment of, hey, there's something that I'm excited about are just so, so precious. And I think that we're always, too quick to, delay starting and delay working on them. And then kind of that beautiful moment, can expire. And then, it went from being like, oh, the words were just, flowing so easily on the page to, hey, you're stuck with a blank page. I think that would be, the first one. And I think the second one would be, just be okay with, shipping or sharing that rough draft. I think that it's, really, really, I think people have really high standards for themselves and they have this vision of, oh, I want this thing to be so perfect and beautiful. And like, the thing about an expert or someone who's really excellent is that they have failed, hundreds of times more than the novice has even tried. Right. And if you just kind of accept that, hey, this is a learning process and you're a little bit more generous with yourself, like when a baby is learning to walk, everyone's kind of celebrating every single stumble, every single, minor, success. And I think that adults should kind of treat themselves with that same generosity and love of like, hey, I want to like keep learning and keep building things and keep, learning throughout life. And the way to do that is kind of be more gentle with yourself and say, hey, look, this is my first version. I'm putting it out. I'm starting to talk about it. And then I think that leads to, again, like make that really amazing thing. It's like the other thing about, so, to kind of draw this back to companies is like so many of the most incredible companies today started out as something, totally different. And trying to think like, PayPal started out like, beaming stuff between Palm Pilots, right? I mean, and then it turned into like this global, amazing payments thing. And I think Facebook started out as like, like a hot or not website. And then now, it has billions of users. I'm trying to think, there's obviously even more crazy pivots. I think another really famous pivot is obviously, Slack. I think Slack started out as like, video game company and then kind of, then became like the most, most popular, corporate messaging thing, right? Oh, I think actually, no, my favorite example is Netflix, right? Netflix started out mailing DVDs to people's homes and now is like replacing Hollywood. I mean, what an insane pivot. You could never predict when you're mailing DVDs to people's homes that you're actually going to become a company that not only kills Blockbuster, which everyone was super skeptical of at the time, but you're actually going to be producing your own streaming service. You're going to be producing. You're going to stop licensing from Hollywood, and you're actually going to start producing your own film. So I just think that that first step is often so much harder than just continuing on and taking all those subsequent steps to becoming, this giant. And Amazon started just mailing books and is now, there's so much revenue is coming from, AWS and their compute service. So it's like, you don't know where that step is going to take you. And just taking that first one is, can sometimes be the hardest. So just get started, do that, get that rough draft out there.
I love both of those. Those are really, really great. Share with our audience where they can find you and your company.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Noor Siddiqui. And the company is called Orchid. Our website is orchidhealth.com. And thank you so much for having me. This was such an amazingly well-researched and thoughtful interview and podcast. So just such an honor to be on, and such an honor to get a chance to chat with you and your amazing audience.
Well, the honor is mine. It was really great having you on, and I wish you all the great success I think you're going to earn.
Oh, thank you so much. So cool to be here.